Chris. So it's a pleasure to be here. And I want to, as Chris said, think today about time and conceptions of time within humanities, but also art, and I'm presuming there'll be some social scientists here as well. Philosophers distinguish between objective time and subjective time. Objective time, if you like, is astronomical time, clock time, one darn thing after another. Subjective time is how we understand time, how we perceive it, what we invest it with, the kind of significance and value, meaning that we put into time. And sometimes people talk about narrative time. We humans are storytelling animals. It's absolutely instinctive to what we do. So we're constantly investing time with significance, we're shaping it, we're giving a certain subjectivity to it. And as an academic, you are a storyteller. You have to tell stories about yourself, not least to get an academic job. Even when you put a CV together, you're constructing some kind of story. Sometimes those stories are somewhat exaggerated. I've seen academics claiming things that are actually quite spurious on investigation. So people tell stories about themselves, and well, we ought to think as Christians about how we tell those stories with integrity. But we also tell stories about our disciplines. We have a sense of how our disciplines have evolved and developed. We tell stories more broadly about human society and how it has developed as well. Now, what I want to think today is about the theme of progress, because I think a progressive conception of time powerfully informs many of our disciplines. Many of the stories we tell and narrate are stories of human progress, and that's been very important in many disciplines in the arts and the sciences. We shouldn't take this for granted as if this is what all humans do, tell linear stories of progress. One can, of course, think of history in cyclical terms, and in ancient society that was quite common to think of history as going around in circles. In modernity, we tend to think of history in linear terms, as moving forwards to some sort of telos, and that perhaps is indicative of the way in which the Judeo-Christian tradition and the biblical narrative, which we were hearing about this morning, has shaped our conceptions of time. That narrative that takes us from creation and fall through the election of Abraham and Israel, to the Messiah, to redemption, the church, the spread of the gospel, the new heavens and the new earth. That Jewish Christian conception of time has actually left a legacy in the way in which even our secular contemporaries think about time. But there are other factors which have shaped our emphasis on progress. The Renaissance, obviously, with a sense, with a break from the medieval past and a new cultural advance. And that was often seen also as a retrieval of antiquity and the glories of antiquity. Same with the Reformation. The Reformation is again often seen as a restoration of primitive Christianity. But nevertheless, both Renaissance humanists and Protestant reformers saw themselves as taking history forward in important ways. But it also owes a lot to the age of discovery, the startling recognition from 1492 onwards, a few years after, that Europeans had discovered an entirely new continent unknown to the ancients, leads to that sense that actually we know more than people in antiquity did. You know, our conception of the world is advanced, is developed. We understand more than they did. The achievements of the scientific revolution reinforced that. And the 18th century Enlightenment, of course, has a powerful sense of progress built into it. The Enlightenment, in a way, can be defined as the project of human betterment in the here and now, the application of reason and critique in order to improve and advance human society. That's the thing that all Enlightenment figures have in common. Marxism reinforces that powerful sense of development, a stadial view of history which it takes over from the Scottish Enlightenment and develops in significant ways. And then, of course, evolutionary theory reinforced that sense that human society itself can evolve. So evolution was taken as an analogy that could be applied to the development of human society. So what you see in the humanities in the modern era are all kinds of narratives of progress. The rise of the West, the rise of liberty and human rights, the rise of democracy, the rise of science, globalization being seen as human progress. But equally, of course, within our disciplines you see critique of those. We've already heard about critique of grand narratives. Lyotard, the French postmodernist, who famously defined postmodernism as incredulity towards meta-narratives. In my own field of history, that critique of these great narratives of progress actually goes back a lot further to the Cambridge historian, Herbert Butterfield, in a book written, I think, in the 1930s, The Whig Interpretation of History. Butterfield argued that these grand stories of progress are actually bad history, or they lead you to write bad history. And the reason is that when you go and look at a past society, what you emphasise is all the modern features of that society, all the features of that society that would go on and shape the modern world. Everything about that society that seems strange or alien, you just leave aside. And so you're not actually doing proper history. You're not really thinking your way into a society which is structured in very different ways, in which the values were very different. You're writing anachronistic history, Whiggish history. And all kinds of historical work has been designed to sort of undo that Whiggishness, that emphasis on, overemphasis on progress. But critiques of those stories of modernisation and progress have also come from various ideologies. Feminism, post-colonialism, Marxism, anti-globalisation, all of these have questioned the complacency of some of the grand narratives that the West has built on. And so those different ideologies exercise a powerful influence within our disciplines in the arts and humanities and the social sciences. But those movements, those ideologies, don't dispose altogether of the idea of progress. They're very sceptical about how much progress has actually occurred to date. But they still think that progress is a possibility, that human betterment is a possibility, and that actually our disciplines should be involved in some kind of project of taking human progress forward in the future. There's a very interesting recent book by the American sociologist Christian Smith, who himself is a Christian, has done work on all kinds of sociological projects in the last 30 years or so. But this book is called The Sacred Project of American Sociology. And he argues that sociologists see themselves as having a mission. It's not just to understand the world, it is, in Marxist terms, to change it. And this is what he says about it. It's worth noting how closely sociology's sacred spiritual project parallels that of Christianity in its structure of beliefs, interests, and expectations. It would not be wrong to say that sociology's project represents essentially a secularized version of the Christian gospel and worldview. Both are teleological, in other words, aimed towards a telos, an end, seeing history as going somewhere of ultimate importance. Both look toward an eventual dramatic transformation of the world in a way that is also importantly linked to smaller transformations in the lives of converted believers here and now. Both now view the basic problem as a kind of bondage to some kind of evil from which humans need to be set free. So notions of progress often inform a sense of what disciplines are there for, that they are to contribute to the whole cause of human progress. They are to lead to a kind of human emancipation. So in a field like literary studies, for example, the emphasis on gender and sexuality, race and imperialism and ecology, on those major themes, leads to a reading of texts in the canon, a rereading of those texts in such a way that will contribute to this project of emancipation, of human betterment, of human progress. So a fundamentally teleological vision of what disciplines are for, even of the redemptive power of our disciplines, is something that you see. And what you see in both those older grand narratives about the rise of the West to democracy and liberty, and in these newer projects of emancipation and of human betterment, is that they're often underwritten by one of the great grand narratives of modernity, the narrative of secularization. Secularization narrative has come under attack from all sorts of directions, but it is very, very powerful, not least in academia. And the sense that this whole story of human progress, this whole story of human emancipation, involves in part secularization, throwing off religious traditions which are actually oppressive, which bind people, is one that's there in the older grand narratives, but is also there in some of these newer projects that one finds within sociology and other disciplines. So it seems to me that notions of time as progress, time as a progressive conception of time, has had a profound influence on our disciplines, particularly in the arts, humanities and social sciences, and of course in a different way in the natural sciences. Now, of course, this isn't the whole story. A great deal of work in our disciplines is highly specialist, even arcane. It's not related to kind of grand projects and ideologies. It's about craftsmanship. And you know, whether you're working on the poetics of John Donne or the workings of the 19th century poor law or techniques of data gathering, a lot of the discussions you have within our disciplines are not about these kind of grandiose ideas of human emancipation and progress. They're about something much finer. And they represent common ground between people of all sorts of different disciplines, that element of craft. But nevertheless, these visions of progress are unquestionably very powerful, and they shape our disciplines in different ways. So, how as Christians should we respond to this fact, to the power of progressive conceptions of time within our discipline? Well, I think first of all, we need to think about how these conceptions of progress have shaped our understanding of our own disciplines. And then we need to think about the larger stories about human progress and think critically about those. So one of the things perhaps Christians have to do is change some of the narrative around our disciplines. One of my friends, Tim Larson, who's an American historian who mostly works on British projects, is wonderful at taking what everybody knows is true and then showing that it isn't. We all know, for example, that Protestant fundamentalism and feminism were polar opposites and completely antagonistic towards each other. So he's written a book about one of the Pankhurst sisters who became a fundamentalist preacher and evangelist in the 1920s. And his feminism and fundamentalism go hand in hand. We all know that the 19th century saw the crisis of faith in Victorian Britain. So many people lost their faith because of the challenges from science and the problem of evil, the problem of hell and so on. He's written a book called Crisis of Doubt, in which he traces about 10 Victorians who lost their faith and then returned to the Christian faith. But the book I perhaps like best is this book he's written on anthropology and the Christian faith, called The Slain God. We tend to think of anthropology as quite hostile to the Christian faith, as undermining Christian faith, as emphasising the culturally constructed nature of reality, as undermining ideas of religion as revelation, instead seeing it as a human construct. But here he writes biographies of 5 or 6 of the most influential British cultural anthropologists from the late 19th century through to the 1970s and 80s. And he starts with a couple who were indeed secularists, people who kind of lost their faith. But then he goes on to look at some of the most influential British cultural anthropologists in the middle of the 20th century. Evans Pritchard, Mary Douglas, Victor Turner, Edith Turner, what each of those figures have in common is they're Catholics. And in a couple of cases, particularly Victor Turner's case, convert to Catholicism from Marxism. So what you get in this book is a sort of desecularization narrative. And a narrative which shows that anthropology could actually lead certain people towards faith. So it's Victor Turner's field work in Africa, working with what traditional anthropology might call primitive tribal societies. I don't say that anymore, but it's his work among these people that opens him up to the supernatural, that leads him to convert to Christianity. So here you have a kind of really striking example of a Christian reworking of standard narratives about a discipline. The standard narrative that this discipline leads inexorably towards secularization, towards doubt, is fundamentally subverted by the way Tim retells a story. And I think there are ways you can do that for different disciplines in different ways to show the debt the different disciplines have to theology, have to Christian faith. Take political theory, for example. Political theory is often conducted in a highly secularized way, because the whole history of the discipline goes back to ancient but also medieval and early modern Christian arguments about political power. And those arguments relate to power in the church, and the analogy between power in the church and power in the state. Early modern political writers like Hobbes and Locke devote a great deal of attention to the exegesis of Scripture. In fact, half of Leviathan and half of Locke's two treatises are basically biblical exegesis, even though modern editions have often left all the biblical stuff out, secularized these figures. Take even a modern figure like John Rawls, the greatest political theorist, I guess, of the last half century, hugely influential figure in our thinking about political liberalism. Recently, someone published one of Rawls' very earliest works, a thesis he wrote, which engages with Lutheran theology and with Anders Nygren in the 1940s. Now, at that stage, Rawls is still a sincere Christian. He comes to lose his faith, but there's this interesting open question about how much his earlier theological formation actually feeds into his account of political theory as something that seeks justice and fairness. Does his earlier meditations on love from a theological perspective actually inform some of his later work? In a number of disciplines, one of the things that we've seen in recent years is what's been sometimes called a religious turn, a turn to religion. So you can see this in literary studies. In 2005, Stanley Fish, the influential American literary critic, pronounced that religious studies, or the study of religion in literature, is where the action is. And Fish is quite a good weather vane for us, seeing where the cutting edges in the discipline of literary studies. And so we have all kinds of recent work in the last couple of decades on the reception history of the Bible within English literature, on sermons as literature, on the Catholic Shakespeare. There's a big debate about whether Shakespeare was Catholic or not, on Jane Austen's Anglicanism and so on. So a renewed sort of attention to religion. Or take philosophy. The atheist philosopher Quentin Smith complains of the desecularization of academia that evolved in philosophy departments since the late 1960s. He complains that a significant number of American philosophy professors are now theists. God, he says, is not dead in academia. He returned to life in the late 1960s and is now alive and well in his last academic stronghold, philosophy department. Now that's not quite true. Philosophy departments are pretty secularized places, but nevertheless, through the work of Nicholas Walterstorff, who was mentioned this morning, and Alvin Plantinga, and figures like Charles Taylor and Alistair MacIntyre, there's no question that there has been a renaissance of Christian philosophy over the last 50 years. So I don't think we need to think of our disciplines in a highly secularized fashion in which they are often thought. We need to, in other words, rethink the kind of narratives that people tell about our disciplines. But we also need to rethink, critique the larger stories that our disciplines tell about human progress. In particular, of course, we need to think critically about the secularization meta-narrative, which is one that many of us as Christians have actually swallowed. A lot of the sense of defeat, the lack of possibility, sense of inevitability of the decline of the church in the West has been due to the fact that Christians have bought into secularization narrative. Secularization theory was not just a theory, in some ways it was a program, and it's often been read as a prophecy. But its predictive power is actually quite weak. Secularization is a phenomenon associated with modernity, unquestionably, but its predictive power is problematic because it failed to predict some of the major developments in the later 20th century, in particular the resurgence of Islam, but also the role played, for example, by the Christian churches in the collapse of communism in 1989, not least the role of the Catholic Church and John Paul II in that wave of democratization. David Martin, the British sociologist of religion, who's done more than anyone else probably to question traditional secularization narrative, wrote a little book a few years ago called Forbidden Revolutions, which was about the resurgence of massive growth of global Pentecostalism and the role of religion in the 1989 revolutions. And these were forbidden because, in a sense, they shouldn't have happened. According to classic secularization, these just should not have happened. But secularization is limited in its power of explaining the world as we see around us. So one thing we need to do is question the grand narrative of secularization, which is still a powerful one, which still appeals very strongly. Not least academics, because academia is often quite a secularized world. So, in universities, the secularization narrative looks quite compelling. But of course, often when you look beyond the walls of universities, it's much less effective. I live in Leicester. Leicester University is quite a secularized place. Leicester as a city is one of the most multi-faith cities on earth. 20% of the population is Muslim, 20% Hindu. There's still a very significant minority of active Christians in the city. There's a mismatch in some ways between the culture of the university and the reality of the city. Secularization narrative doesn't really help you to understand the city of Leicester, the way in which religion is still a really powerful presence in people's lives. So we need to criticise and deconstruct the strong secularization narrative, which sees modernization as necessarily entailing secularization. But we also need to critique some of these grander stories about human progress, which are told, and often told in highly secularized form. So take the stories that people tell about the emergence of ideas of human rights, for example. Quite a lot of recent work has emphasised how ideas of human rights actually have deep roots in the Christian past. Ideas of subjective natural rights really emerge in the Middle Ages with canon lawyers and other figures. You get very powerful defences of human rights. The Christians are very actively involved in the emergence of international human rights in the 1940s, but actually Catholic and Protestant activists play a really major role in the creation of the UN Declaration of Human Rights and lobbying for these. Or take anti-slavery. In some ways, modern progressive politics is the offspring of the Christian anti-slavery movement of the 18th and 19th centuries, which is itself a kind of aberrant social movement, something that was utterly without precedent in the history of the world at that point, a movement that thought you could eradicate slavery from the face of the earth. It's a movement so deeply deeply saturated in Christianity and Christian convictions. Or take the stories that are told about the progress of science. Again, these have often been highly secularized. Particularly in the late 19th century, there were a couple of major American works on the history of the warfare between science and religion, the conflict between science and religion. That conflict model was deeply influential and still is the way many people think about science and religion. Just this week I've been kind of setting work for undergraduates on science and religion in 17th century England. It's interesting reading some of the coursework because you can tell students are genuinely surprised to discover that 17th century scientists were often deeply devout. You know, people like Isaac Newton, Robert Boyle, and so on, because we're conditioned to think of science and religion as conflicting, incompatible enterprises and ways of looking at the world. But a great deal of the history of science in the last half century has emphasised the way in which religion and science are imbricated together. Take even the Enlightenment. Studies of the Enlightenment, again, are the way we look at the Enlightenment, both secular people and Christians, tends to see the Enlightenment as simply hostile to religion, simply hostile to Christianity. Recent work on the Enlightenment tends to emphasise that the mainstream of the Enlightenment does not want to do away with religion or Christianity. There is a radical Enlightenment, if you like, which is secularist, which is even atheistic, though it's interesting how late atheism really emerges as a powerful force within the Enlightenment. It's only really in the 1760s and 70s, with de Holbach and other Diderot and other figures in the French Enlightenment, that it emerges. And Voltaire, who we think of as a deeply sceptical figure, quite rightly, is actually very worried about the emergence of atheism within the French Enlightenment at that point. Most Enlightenment thinkers are theists. Many of them would still see themselves as Christians, though many of them are engaged in liberalising Christian theology. So the Enlightenment is problematic for Christians in all sorts of ways, but it is not simply an atheistic movement. And many of the most important early Enlightenment thinkers like Locke and Leibniz are themselves deeply committed Christians, if often heterodox. In fact, one recent book by David Sorkin argues that contrary to the secular master narrative, the Enlightenment was not only compatible with religious belief, but conducive to it. So one thing we have to do is, if you like, reinsert religion into our stories, or our understanding of these key developments in what are often seen as the history of human progress. But finally, I think we need to recognise what gets lost in grand narratives about progress and the glorification of progress, the cult of the modern, the cult of the novel. It seems that in recent years it's Catholics in particular who are inclined to write narratives of loss. You think of Alistair MacIntyre's history of Western philosophy, or MacIntyre, a very interesting figure because he's kind of a Marxist Thomist, an interesting mix of influences there. Or you think of Charles Taylor's major works, Secular Age and Sources of the Self, in which he does see and understand and sympathise with the development of modern notions of the self and of the secular, but also has this acute sense of what's being lost in the whole process. Or Brad Gregory's recent book on the unintended Reformation, which sees the Reformation is responsible for many of the ills of the modern world. So if you read it, you become very depressed by how awful the modern world is. And he traces a lot of these ills back to Luther and beyond, and to Duns Scotus and others. So Catholic writers in recent years have written a number of these major works which emphasise what we've lost in the whole process of modernisation, which question some of the celebratory accounts of human progress that are all around us. But of course there's also a Protestant tradition of writing histories of declension, of what's gone wrong in the West. So finally I think we need to think about how secular visions of time can be impoverished. First of all, the cult of the modern can lead to a loss of a sense of tradition, to a presentism that sort of locks us in a parochial way just to our own time. G.K. Chesterton said that Christianity teaches the democracy of the dead, that our reference groups that Christian academics need to do is to engage in projects of resource model, as they call it in the French Catholic tradition, where we draw on the kind of resources of the past, where we, I think a lovely phrase this morning, roots down, walls down, where we sink deep roots into the past. And maybe one of the gifts that Christian academics can give to the church is a deeper sense of tradition. We can kind of excavate, if you like, hidden treasures and riches in the past and bring them to the surface for our contemporaries. Things that are often forgotten, the riches that we can draw on. But secular visions at times, as well as leading to a loss of tradition, can of course also crucially lead to a loss of transcendence. Charles Taylor talks about the immanent frame, the way that you can live wholly within the mundane, within the here and now, without any sense of openness to a transcendent dimension. That time is not infused with any transcendent meaning. The here and the now is all there is no hereafter. We are acutely conscious of the temporal with very little sense of the eternal. No hope in a new heavens and a new earth, let alone for a beatific vision. Now, of course, some writers, Christopher Hitchens would be a good example, will say that this is actually a good thing. That if all you believe in is the here and now, you're going to make sure that you make the here and now better. But it also, of course, puts enormous weight on the here and now. Everything has to be achieved in the here and now. Visions of perfection have to be achieved in the here and now. And there's a danger, and there has been the danger in modern history of secular ideologies which try and achieve an ideal world, imposing that in a way that's actually deeply brutal and suppressive. One of the things Christianity gives us, and I think Augustine really develops this idea in The City of God in particular, is this tension between the here and the hereafter, the now and the not yet. The Christians believe that the rule of God, the kingdom of God, has been inaugurated in Christ. And in a sense, the church wants to embody that rule and the beauty of God's rule in the present, and yet we're also conscious that it cannot be fully achieved in the present. That reconciles us to a degree to the imperfections of the present, and we look beyond the here and the now to the hereafter, to the new heavens and the new earth, and to the achievement of God's rule in the future. So let me finish there and just ask a few questions, and maybe you can take 3 or 4 minutes to discuss them with the person next to you. So one of these questions is, how do you see a progressive conception of time at work in your discipline? So, I mean, do you see strong notions of progress or projects, progressive projects, as a significant force within your discipline? What kind of narratives are being told by your contemporaries? And how should Christians in academia revise these stories and offer new kinds of narrative? So maybe if you want...
Yeah, I suggest just read those questions one more time.
Yeah, so the first question is, you might not get through them all, but how do you see a progressive conception of time at work in your discipline? What kind of narratives have been told by your contemporaries? And how should Christians in academia revise these stories and offer